Scousers want to be their own people, but they would like to be embraced as well. So, I think Liverpool's this interesting mixture of spikiness and welcoming to the world. That makes it quite a place where outsiders have actually had, huge connections to the city. And I talk about a couple in the book. Obviously, they bookend the book really, Bill Shankly and Jürgen Klopp. So it's a city, I think, that, with some caveats, if we get into the wider history of the city, has welcomed outsiders. And they often, as Neil Atkinson of the Anfield Rapper said, the best Scousers are often from outside Liverpool.
Every time one of the big clubs shows up on this humble podcast, the audience is a little larger. And maybe I should do more of these kinds of episodes, but I always shirk back a little bit, too mainstream. And then I think, who of those that are curious about football culture and into Liverpool of all clubs wouldn't already have found another more professional media outlet on that topic? Well, in this case, if that is you, I think you need this. I think you need to buy this book. And first, please hear about it too. And if you like it, please spread the word. If you don't, spread it to those you don't like. So, Alan McDougall has written what the subtitle says is a people's history of Liverpool FC. I would say it's a global people's history. It's published by Cambridge University Press. It's very readable and accessible, but with high scholarly standards. Not a straight up club history, always with an eye on culture, society, and football more broadly, but never far from the club that the author has grown up to love. It's a story of deindustrialization, migration, the tragedies of Heysel and Hillsborough, the triumphs around it. And it's about Bill Shankly and Jürgen Klopp. The author, Alan McDougall, is a professor of history at the University of Guelph in Canada, and he has been on here before to talk about his fabulous older book, The People's Game, about soccer in East Germany. We talked about Dynamo in Berlin. For this one, he has returned to his football home and done what not many club histories do. He's written a book that you'll enjoy reading, you'll enjoy following its connections and learning about its world, even if you don't support Liverpool. One more word, these starred ratings and reviews, they really do the most to help a small podcast's visibility like this one. Please consider leaving one right now before we get started. And let's go. Alan, welcome back. Together we travel to the German Democratic Republic together and Dynamo Berlin. This time we're closer to your spiritual home that you now have the luxury to write about. You're still an academic historian. All that is true. This is an academic book. But maybe tell us a little bit about what's the connection to Liverpool in the first place, and why did you, of all people, need to write an academic book about Liverpool FC?
Yeah, well, the connections to Liverpool is family, really. My dad's side of the family, as I relate in some of the early bits of the book. My dad was born in Liverpool 4, which is the kind of district where both Anfield and Everton's former ground, Goodison, are located. He actually grew up nearer to Goodison. So his older brother, my Uncle Ian, was an Everton fan. Everton at the time, in the 50s, were actually the bigger club. So Dad, I guess, pick the opposite, as you do, I suppose, when you're brothers, and he became a Liverpool fan. Lost in the midst of time why he did. So yeah, it was really through family connections to the city. My granddad lived in Liverpool all his life, and until he died in 1998, we'd go back and visit from the south of England, because like a lot of Liverpudlians, Dad and his brother sort of moved south during the economic hardships that hit the city from sort of post-war period, particularly in the 80s. And so we'd go back regularly, and back in the day, and at least until sort of the 21st century commodification and gentrification of everything about football, you could still get tickets fairly easily to until 1994 to get on the Kop or to kind of get to the ground. So yeah, that was really the basis for it. Then of course I moved to Canada and I took up my job teaching history here at the University of Guelph. Obviously, was a Liverpool fan long before I became a historian. So, that was always the first passion, as you kindly mentioned, and we talked about before. In another podcast, I kind of gravitated academically to football history through my sort of PhD subject, which was Communist East Germany. wrote The People's Game. I think the first, sort of, certainly in English, the first history of football in communist East Germany, and wrote another book on sort of the global history of football, a bit more of a kind of a survey book. And then, I was at the point in my life.
That one fell into the pandemic, right?
It did. Absolutely. I was going to have a book launch, and then I think it literally came out, that book, in the sort of week that the pandemic broke globally, sort of March 2020. And bad timing. But still a good book. Anyway. And then, so I suppose I was at the point in my life and career where, my main aim here was to write a book that, as you say, has sort of academic credentials and an academic publisher, but that other people
and makes a lot of money, of course.
Yeah, well, basically, that other people would read, like someone like my mum, who's a huge Liverpool fan, would read, or people who don't want to read academic books, but want to read interesting things about sport. And, I felt I was reasonably qualified to do that because, I had the sort of historian skills, but I had the sort of passion, I suppose, and insight into the club as well. And I think, that made for a good combination. And it was a very enjoyable process writing it. Just kind of a giant vanity project, really, Philip. And
the project from the heart as well.
Project from the heart is a much nicer way to put it. Absolutely.
Yeah. The publisher is Cambridge University Press. While we're on, to ask a question here, how did that choice come about? I mean, what you just described is, at least in my mind, is the listenership of this podcast. So the kind of persons who are interested in football and aren't super scared about an academic book if it's on a topic that connects.
Yeah,
it certainly does. But academic publishers and football books are still. I mean, that's not a mainstream trend. Often football books, publishers. Why do you think Cambridge was interested in the first place, and how did you pitch it? Did you wanted it to be an academic book, right?
No, I didn't really want it to be an academic book. In fact, when Cambridge approached me, because I'd worked with Cambridge previously, the People's Game was published by Cambridge. And so I had a connection with Cambridge through that book. And then Cambridge approached me because I think they kind of knew I wanted to work on something related to Liverpool, and to kind of see where I was at a few years ago. And the first thing I said to Michael Watson at Cambridge, my editor, was, I didn't want to write another academic book. I wanted to be able to swear. I didn't want to write. I wanted to have conversations, not discourses. I wanted it to be a book that would not be off-putting to people who weren't in academia, I suppose. Because the East German book, I think, was reasonably accessible, but I still talked about Eigensinn and had to place it in the historiography, both for the kind of book I wanted to write and the point in my life and career I was at. I didn't really want to have to jump through those hoops again. And from Cambridge's perspective, like a lot of university presses, they're obviously trying to sell books. I think that Cambridge certainly have tried to branch out into trade publications, so works that have academic quality but are pitched at a wider market, I would say, and are marketed a bit differently and more extensively, I would say. So, gave it a try, and I got a couple of great book launch events out of it here in Toronto and in Liverpool at the Sandon pub, where the club was basically founded in 1892. So, it all worked out, and and it's great. I mean, I think sports history to me is a great means to kind of get for academics to connect with a wider audience, because so many people love sport and can connect to it. So I think if we can write books that are accessible, but that have the extra expertise and research that we can bring to topics, it should be a good combination.
Mm-hmm. And we'll talk about your sources in a little bit. This is an interesting collection, including interviews. I want to process went later on. Liverpool, to me, is one of those cities that I pretty much only knew through football, and I'm sure I'm not the only one. I mean, vaguely there in the background from my dad. Yes, the Beatles were from there, but I have a vivid first Liverpool image in my mind in some sports magazine I saw growing up, and it's Patrick Berger.
Yeah. Patrick Berger, my favorite player.
White Reebok jersey with Carlsberg on the front, and I
had that shirt.
Okay, so
and I had the 15 burger Patrick Philip because I love Patrick Burger. Oh my goodness! Wow, yeah.
That picture is kind of seared in my mind for no apparent reason.
He's a good-looking guy.
That was all Liverpool to me was the Reds.
Yeah.
What I didn't know is a lot of the urban history, global history of Liverpool that you bring in this book. And what I also didn't know is that Liverpool is because it's the younger club in the city, and it wasn't always number one. You mentioned the founding event in the pub with drinking, I assume.
Yeah, some drinking or debates about drinking.
One of the supposed reasons for the split, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Everton, the Protestant club.
Yeah.
Could it be? I mean, this is not an old firm kind of rivalry.
No, it's not. And, you know, I mean, there were a few reasons for the sort of Liverpool-Everton split. I mean, some of it was, John Holding, who had been at Everton and broke away to found Liverpool and kind of Liverpool took over the ground that is Anfield today, was a brewer in the city, a Tory, a Conservative, and there was some temperance supporters and liberals on the board at Everton who kind of didn't like maybe some of Holding's politics and sort of moral views, but also felt that he was kind of ripping the club off. So yeah, it was, money, drink, a little bit of politics, a little bit of religion, all of that played into the original split. But yes, as you rightly say, Everton were the older club in the city, 1878. Liverpool were the upstarts, only coming along in 1892 and taking Everton's ground. I mean, people don't really think about it now, but Everton played at Anfield before Liverpool did. So, there's all of that history. And then, as you say, there's Liverpool's sort of global history, which of course is inextricably linked to something that's quite complicated for the city to deal with even today, which is its huge position in the slave trade and as the second city of empire for a long time during the period of slavery and then even in the abolition period. So there's a lot going on in Liverpool beyond the football, but I think you're right. You're not the only one, I think, for whom if people think of the city of Liverpool, if they're a bit older, as you say, they might think of the Beatles, but otherwise they think of football. The football was the club's main form of civic identity and sort of global recognition, particularly when the city started going downhill economically, which, you can date back to 1930s, if you like. You can date certainly from the 1980s onwards. So, I think football's always been integral to the city's identity and probably only got more so, I would say.
Both clubs are from roughly the same area,
yes.
too. How do supporters sort themselves in the early days? Before the whole globalization.
It's interesting. I mentioned at the start of our talk that, in my dad's family, and I think more widely in our family, we're fairly evenly divided between red and blue. There are actually more reds, which probably makes sense in the sense of the sort of evolution of the two clubs since my dad and uncle became supporters. Like I say, in the 50s, Everton were known as the Mersey millionaires. They were the big spenders. Goodison was the more developed ground. It was the one England used for the World Cup in 1966. And Liverpool at this time, from 1954 through to the early 60s, were in what is now the Championship, was then Division 2. So they'd been relegated until Bill Shankly became manager in 1959. They were kind of, like your classic sleeping giant, really, a club that had potential but had underachieved for 30 years. And Everton, meanwhile, had, English football was much more competitive then, but had been more successful than Liverpool, had more money than Liverpool. So I think because the two clubs grew up so sort of close together in the two grounds, there are, it's a mile across Stanley Park, really, between Goodison and Anfield, meant that, and because the sectarian divisions weren't as profound as they were in Glasgow, meant that, I think a lot of Liverpool families had reds and blues. And interestingly, chatting to Dad when I was, interviewed my parents for the book, and, he remembered what I know football fans in Manchester, for example, experienced in the 50s and maybe into the 60s, which was 1 week you go and watch Everton at Goodison, and then, of course, Everton would be away. So then next week you go and watch Liverpool at Anfield. So the idea of a heated rivalry was always there, but there was also a lot of people like my dad and his brother who went to Goodison as well as to Anfield, and that wasn't seen as some great betrayal.
That narrative, Liverpool against the rest of the country. So second city um, with its own lookout, I think, the city
Yeah.
that has for a long time in its history looked west, looked toward the
Hmm.
Atlantic. Um, is that true for both clubs as an early part of their identity, but both Everton and Liverpool as representatives of a city that kind of rubs the rest of the country wrong way or gets rubbed by the rest of the country the wrong way?
Yeah.
True for both?
Yeah, I would say it is. I mean, I think there's a couple of things there. One is that sort of Liverpool against England. I don't think it's always been there in quite the same way we imagine it now. I think that has developed much more. It's become much more entrenched in Liverpool since the 80s and the Thatcherite revolution and the kind of the quote unquote managed decline of the city, the uprising in Toxteth in 1981, massive unemployment. So I think, and then consequently in the national press, and again, this relates to football, the Heysel and Hillsborough disasters differently, stereotypes about the city that often were developed through football. So I think that's really a relatively late 20th century phenomenon. But I think it is shared on both sides, on both the blue and the red banks of the Mersey, so to speak. And if you talk to Everton fans, they will tell you, they're the self-styled people's club, right? That they are the club that is still rooted more authentically in the city.
Mm-hmm. Now in the Docklands.
Yeah, and well, interestingly, they've now moved to a new stadium in a kind of an area of Liverpool that, it's still. I mean, that's sort of the northern Liverpool, the area of the docks around there has been underdeveloped or in decline for a long time. There's kind of bits of gentrification and rebuilding going on there, but that's still a project in process. It's quite a big risk for Everton, I think, moving, but so far, relatively so good in early days, I guess. But yes, as a consequence, I think, of Liverpool from really the 60s onwards becoming this, as I talk about in the book, more internationally known club. Everton, I think, and again, this is probably in more recent history, have kind of drawn more strongly on that local identity because, the knock on Liverpool is that all of Liverpool supporters are from Norway, which, depending on statistics, you believe is possibly true. 1 in 4 Norwegians is a Liverpool fan or something silly along those lines. But yeah, but then to bring it back to the Hillsborough disaster, I think, Everton supporters and the Everton community were fantastically supportive in that long and ongoing, frankly, battle for justice. And I think that sort of the sense of the country against the city was really entrenched by Hillsborough, and that affected both Blues and Reds, because although it was 97 Liverpool supporters who died in Sheffield in April 1989, obviously there were Everton fans in it. Yeah.
Yeah. The reason, part of why I'm asking much about the early story of the city here, is that the subtitle of the book is A People's History of Liverpool FC. I get Howard Zinn vibes.
Yeah, some Zinn vibes, maybe.
Subtitle. I have to say, the way you set up that promise, you certainly deliver it in terms of the interviews and the focus on supporters and what it means to support Liverpool, and not just in the city. It's very much a global history too. Why did that strike you as the kind of the missing link in all the Liverpool literature, and what does a people's history here mean to you?
Yeah, I mean, that's interesting because to go back to our discussion about publishers and book titles, actually, initially I think the subtitle of the book was a bit more of an academic one, which was a social history of Liverpool FC from Shankly to Klopp. And social history, that means something to academics. We understand what social history is. But for most people who might be picking up a book, social history, it's neither here nor there, I don't think. And so actually it was the publisher, Cambridge, who suggested the switch. And I remember chatting to my dad, who didn't particularly like it. And it took a bit of time to get used to. I kind of liked the link between the People's Game and this subtitle in this book, so it kind of gave me a bit of a Cambridge link. And, that was what I was trying to do with the book, was to use particularly the interviews. I did 55 or so interviews for the book from, as you say, from fans from around the world as well as locally, to kind of tell the story and have some of the narratives of some of the, the longer standing fans sort of running like a red thread through the book. So, and, I was interested in telling, the people's voices, not just, there are some pretty well-known Liverpool supporters and people locally who've been very active in supporting the club. But I wanted to get firstly international voices. You know, Liverpool's big following around the world, which I've seen firsthand in many places. And you just think, how did you become such a crazy red? And I also wanted to try and bring in the very sort of under-examined history of, well, women's fandom, but also as a kind of an element of the club's history, the story, the sort of still neglected story of the women's team. So, yeah, the people's voices were meant to be the supporters, but with that emphasis, I think, particularly on women and on the international community that has come to support Liverpool from, you know, Rwanda to New Zealand.
Yeah, and it works, as I said, and it's carried through well. Normally, I have to confess, a topic like Liverpool FC would not be high on my priority list. I don't normally do much on clubs, but the way you're orienting this here works really well.
Yeah, that is interesting, because I often struck me years ago that sort of academic club history, certainly in the English-speaking world, are quite few and far between. Yeah. As you'll know, like certainly in the German language, I can think of myriad club histories by academics that are kind of, you know, like Borussia Dortmund in the NS Zeit or the Nazi time, or, you know, so I think the kind of tradition of club histories is actually a bit more developed in Germany than in the English-speaking world. I think partly because people would tend to think club histories are going to be partisan, which, you know, obviously mine is. And I think, you know, I suppose there's also the sense that it's, for some clubs, it would be quite a narrow audience. Now, probably because of Liverpool's global following these days, that's not the case. But yeah, it's, and I suppose institutional histories can sometimes be a bit, depending how you do them, can sometimes be a bit dry. But I think if you put the voices of the supporters to the forefront, you know, that makes it interesting. And I think that's what people outside academia like. They like stories. History is about stories and about characters. And yeah, there's lots of them in the book.
The other reason I would normally be more hesitant to engage with Liverpool is, frankly, I always found them a little bit annoying, a little bit too obsessed with their own uniqueness.
Yeah. I mean, that's
right? As a club and perhaps as a city too. And after reading this, though, especially the decades you focus on, Shankly, I can see why.
Yeah. I mean, I have a quote, I think, from Rory Smith early in the book about Liverpool's self-aware otherness. And I think that's quite a nice way of putting it. Like a sense that we know we're different, and there's a kind of a bit of yes, it can come off as a bit of a superiority complex. I think the interesting thing about Liverpool, both as a club and a city, is there's a kind of, to me, and of course I'm biased because, you know, half my family's from there. I've spent my life thinking about the football team, but there's a bit of an endearing vulnerability to that. It's kind of, there's a bit of an element of insecurity to it. Like, I think, you know, Scousers want to be their own people, but they would like to be embraced as well. So, you know, I think Liverpool's this interesting mixture of spikiness and welcoming to the world. So, you know, that makes it quite a place where outsiders have actually had, you know, huge connections to the city. And I talk about a couple in the book. Obviously, they bookend the book really, Bill Shankly and Jürgen Klopp. So it's a city, I think, that, with some caveats, if we get into the wider history of the city, has welcomed outsiders. And they often, as Neil Atkinson of the Anfield Rapper said, you know, the best Scousers are often from outside Liverpool.
Yeah. No. And it's those people, those characters, and the successes. And then there's the tragedies.
Yeah.
The city and for the club that also forged that mentality a little bit. How hard was it to write about Heysel?
Yeah, that was the hardest chapter to write by quite a stretch.
Yeah. I'm very curious about that chapter and thought you did really well, but I imagine it must have been a hard one to write.
Yes.
Take up there a little bit and let us know what's happening there and how your writing went.
Yeah, it was the hardest one to write because, as I relate in the chapter on Heysel, there's no getting around the fact that Heysel is a massive stain on the club's history. And
1985.
Brussels, yeah. European Cup final, as we called it in those days, in a crumbling stadium, the Heysel Stadium. They've been used for a lot of events before. Liverpool versus Juventus. At the sort of height, certainly in England and certainly in other parts of Europe too, of the sort of hooliganism, but also I'd say of hooligan paranoia and media hysteria. And, there'd been a bit of previous between Liverpool and another set of Italian fans, Roma fans, at the 1984 European Cup final. Roma fans had attacked Liverpool fans in Rome, where the final was. And that, I think, had left some literal as well as sort of psychological scars. And then before the final, of course, in the Heysel Stadium, things were a bit tense, and Liverpool fans, or a small group of Liverpool fans, charged a group of Juventus fans who got into a nominally neutral section right next to the Liverpool section. So stadium planning was a disaster. UEFA was fully culpable. And but in the process, those fans, running really for their lives, ran away from the Liverpool fans, and a wall collapsed, and 39 predominantly Juve supporters were killed. So, as I say in the chapter, to me, Heysel, even taking aside the Liverpool, is the biggest. It's arguably one of the biggest events in European football history, and it has always baffled me that it doesn't get more discussion and coverage. The equivalent of the Champions League final, live on television around the world, an audience of millions, kind of watching this horror unfold or not unfold. And they kept playing. Yes, absolutely. Which has happened in other sports-related disasters before. But yeah, as I talk about in the book, depending on where you were watching the game that night, some countries kept the screens on. We did in England, they did in Italy. I know East Germany turned off the television, so it wasn't broadcast in East Germany. But yes, it's a difficult chapter to write because there's no way to sugarcoat the fact that it is this stain on the club's history. And you can contextualize as much as you like. The Heysel Stadium was a crumbling wreck and should never have been used for a European Cup final. UEFA was completely culpable, and in fact was found culpable in a Belgian court of law for their role in the tragedy. So was the Belgian FA. The police were a joke. They didn't even have functioning walkie-talkies. It was amateur hour. Some Juventus fans also behaved aggressively and violently. There's context. But in the end, the disaster was caused by the behaviour of a small minority, yes, of Liverpool supporters. And so the chapter, I think, deals with a lot of the sort of rather tortuous self-reckoning with the disaster of the city of Liverpool after May 1985. And, my own sort of reckoning with the disaster. And yeah, a difficult chapter to write because it feels a bit like, if you pardon the crude language, shitting on your own doorstep, right? It's a critical lens to be held up to the club and the city in a way. And I do that in other parts of the book, I think, on the issue of race and racism in certain parts of the book. But in contrast to the chapter on Hillsborough, which you can kind of, despite the scale of the horror in that chapter, you can read as a sort of an uplifting and affirming story of resistance and collectivity. It's harder to take those learnings from the Heysel chapter, which is this kind of very shameful episode that I think, as I talk about in the chapter, has been swept under the carpet, certainly in Liverpool, but I would argue also by UEFA and in Italy, and is still not being discussed enough, I would say.
The day broke, it was apparent how little effect the flimsy barriers had in protecting a panicking crowd. Among the jumble of discarded horns and banners, the crumbled remains of a few concrete posts.
She said there was about 30.
And you weren't aware of this?
No, we didn't know anybody was dead.
Well, it just happened so quick. I mean, the supporters, it was the minority again, the supporters that ran over to cause trouble. And the Italians just panicked.
You must blame the Liverpool supporters, how they started the trouble. But it all started out the Juventus supporters that have tickets for our end.
I'll never go again. I've watched Liverpool for 30 odd years. No way I'll go again. No way. I'm just ashamed. Total disgrace.
They watched their victorious team return in silence. In Italy, the word used to describe the event is massacre. Their European Cup now holds no value for them.
And during one of the most successful international runs of the club as well.
Mm-hmm. And brought that run crushing to a halt. I mean, it's just from a football history point of view, it's arguably the beginning of the end of Liverpool's great period of dominance from 1964 when they first entered the European Cup to 1985. The club was still successful probably until the late 80s and early 90s, but then there was a second disaster at Hillsborough, and things started to unravel from that point onwards. But I think Heysel you could certainly see as the beginning of the end of that period of dominance, because of course Liverpool, like other English clubs, but for longer, was banned from European competition for over 5 years.
Yeah. On the flip side of that period, I always found it fascinating that all that travel and the constant exposure in fact, to travel to Italy and the exposure to other fan cultures made Liverpool fans the fashion forward.
That's
the casuals, right? Because they brought home the track suits from Italy and all that. So a lot of that fashion stuff Liverpool fans introduced.
Yeah, they got the Sergio Tacchini and Elise from Italy, and did some shopping, both legal and illegal, in Paris for the 1981 European Cup final, and developed this. It's funny, I talk in the chapter that's kind of focused on the 80s about one of the first music/football fanzines in Liverpool, The End, and it's sometimes styled as a football fanzine, but it's not like the football fanzines that later develop in the 80s and 90s in Germany and England and elsewhere. It's more of a music fanzine by people who like football as well. But most of that magazine, The End, which ran from 1981 to 1988, is about clothing. It's all about fashion and, what's in and what's out. And what a wool would wear. A wool in Scouse terminology is someone who just doesn't get it, who's not from Liverpool. And a wool can be, where my cousins grew up, which was Melling, which was just outside the city centre. Or it could be someone from, somewhere they're treated with contempt, like Leeds or other bits of Lancashire. So, clothing and identity was kind of a very important part of the sort of continentalization or Europeanization of Liverpool and its fan base. And I think that's one of the reasons why Heysel becomes so painful for that generation of supporters, was because they prided themselves on, European know-how. They got the cool clothes from elsewhere. They didn't pay their train fares. They do some shoplifting. They drink too much, but they weren't hooligans who carried knives and had set piece fights and all of these things. And so I think that made Heysel perhaps all the more painful and more difficult to deal with, because Liverpool had a relatively good record in terms of fan behaviour in Europe, and had also, I'd say, embraced the sort of the cultural exchange, to use an academic term, of kind of, the Saint-Etienne funds in 1977 when they stole Allez les Verts and made it Allez les Rouges, Italian fashions, sightseeing in Paris, all of these things. And of course, conversely, that's when, as I talk about with some of my interviews, that's when you start to get West and East Germans or New Zealanders or South Africans just starting to get a glimpse of Liverpool as a bit of a global force, which is kind of interesting too.
And often the English club that hits that generation first.
Absolutely.
But also the vibe, the reputation.
Maybe
that's how the Norwegians come to Liverpool. And wasn't Liverpool on TV there earlier than
Liverpool. The weird situation where live English league matches don't happen in England until 1983, but in Norway, from I think about 68 or 69, you could watch an English league game one every weekend, and it was because Liverpool were consistently the dominant force, or the leading force, I would say, not the dominant force in English football from that period onwards. They got to be seen more than anyone else. If that had happened 10 years earlier, it would have been no doubt the Busby Babes, Manchester United, who in many ways, had even in the 60s, had more glamorous players and more glamorous team with Best and Dennis Law. That certainly plays into Liverpool's support in parts of Scandinavia. And then there's also the connections that were made through the matches, right? Liverpool builds a big fan base in Iceland, partly because Liverpool's first ever European game is against KR Reykjavik, and that kind of develops.
They get a very warm welcome in Liverpool.
Yeah, they do. Absolutely. Yeah. And so it's kind of like, as we would say in German, it's like a kind of form of Fanfreundschaft, like fan friendship that develops, I think, between certain clubs that Liverpool encounter, Borussia Mönchengladbach being another one from a German context, and fans from other parts of the world just being quite impressed by some elements of the Kop that were original. And, you can debate how original they are. Liverpool's not the only place in the world. Anfield's not the only place in the world with a loud terrace culture. But there were definitely elements of that story, I think, in the 60s that made Liverpool at the forefront of kind of a change in terrace culture and a kind of, I think, an originality and a humour that you don't see as often at Liverpool now because, like everywhere, the tickets are very hard to get. They're very expensive. The crowd has changed. Yeah. But still, you can rock it out. And I've seen it on big nights. The Liverpool crowd can just switch and there's suddenly this feral atmosphere. There's kind of spontaneous singing. It's very, it's still there, it's kind of, but it just doesn't get brought out so often, I'm saying.
And there's a tradition of very special connection between the manager and the crowd too. Both your heroes in the subtitle, Shankly.
Yeah.
Building that connection to city and to supporters in a way that you don't often see at big clubs.
No, I mean, Liverpool has an interest.
Super clubs right now.
Yeah, it's interesting. Liverpool, I mean, has quite the manager, it seems to me, at Liverpool is put on a pedestal more than in many other places. If you think about the revolving door of managers at many big European clubs, I don't think, for example, to take a German example, I don't think Bayern Munich, the manager is not reified in the way a Liverpool manager has been. And I think that's a legacy of Bill Shankly, who's really the kind of dominant character in certainly the middle part of the book, that he became this figure who transformed the club and with it the city, I think, that he created this sort of almost unmatchable standard for a manager who connected with the supporters, who kind of represented the city. And, you can do lots of interesting Shankly, Klopp, pub discussions, but I think you would say with Klopp, albeit in a different time, that he's the manager who came closest to replicating that. And, managers in between have been revered too. And, Kenny Dalglish is probably the underrated figure here because of his kind of the extraordinary role he played after the Hillsborough disaster.
Yeah. And maybe let's get back to that quick. But
sure.
I've noticed that especially when Klopp handed over to Slot, it happened in front of the stand. Unusual.
Yeah.
That's not normally how manager transitions go.
No. And if you remember, I mean, the way it happened, I mean, it's all stage managed these days, these things, right? So the club has, kind of the media to make it look good. And so it's very different. It's less organic than it was in Shankly's day. But, I think it is unusual that Jürgen Klopp, as he was the outgoing Liverpool manager, was leading Anfield in a chant for Arne Slot. That's not usual behaviour. And I think that speaks to, the reverence for Klopp, who was a bit of a Shankly-like figure, I think. I don't think any Liverpool fan has much bad to say about Klopp because of that transformative effect that I think Shankly had. But it also speaks to that, the way in which managers are held in high regard in Liverpool. So if they fall short of that, as Arne Slot's found a little bit this season, critics can be quite unforgiving, Yeah.
You mentioned Kenny Dalglish, late 80s, early 90s, and the aftermath of what happens in Sheffield. The Hillsborough tragedy, different from Heysel, feeds into the club's kind of story of resilience in a different way, and continues to until this day. Fight isn't done.
No.
Much easier chapter to write than Heysel?
It was easier in a way. I mean, partly because there's been a lot of, you're standing on the shoulders of giants, particularly Phil Scraton, who's done a lot of brilliant work in researching the Hillsborough disaster and bringing injustice to light. It's obviously something that's a much more sort of discussed and accepted part of Liverpool's cultural history, both the club and the city. So, but I went through a lot of the documents from the Hillsborough Independent Inquiry. And, those are hard documents to read, right? Eyewitness accounts of fans who were there, watching fellow fans suffocating to death while the police stood there expecting a riot and hooligan behavior. And so the fans took matters into their own hands, literally ripping up advertising boards to try and save lives. But there was only one fucking ambulance in the stadium. So, I think, as I say in the opening part of that, Josh, and the difficulty of writing about Hillsborough is even now, it makes you so angry to think about it, right? My cousin was at the game and luckily was fine. But most Liverpool supporters, I think, know someone who was either at the game or on the Leppings Lane terrace where the crushing happened. So it's an intrinsic part of the club's history. And I'd argue it's probably become the single biggest element of the club's history in terms of its identity. The flames for the 97 are carried on the back of the shirt. And talking to fans from around the world, the things when they chose Liverpool, because, fans, that's what they do. They choose an English club. And so why do you choose a club? If you love the Premier League in India or somewhere, and Hillsborough's a distinctive element of Liverpool's story, it makes Liverpool, both the club and the city, stand out. So it was really interesting and quite moving to talk to fans from different parts of the world who'd educate themselves on the disaster and the injustice afterwards. So yeah, it's become an essential part of the club's identity and the city's identity. And in that sense, I suppose the chapter wrote itself. But it's, and I don't think it's a story you can ever be retold too often, really. I mean, it's part of a spate of disasters in England in the late 80s, I would say, that reflect on a very deregulated society in which, frankly, ordinary people, whether they're oil rig workers, football supporters, commuters on trains, ferry passengers, are not really treated with much respect. And so I think it is part of a wider story of crisis and disaster that strikes Britain in that period as well.
And problems in policing.
And problems in policing, absolutely. I mean, I mentioned briefly, and I was actually doing a chat about the book last week, and someone was asking about that perhaps could have been played up more in my chapter, was that the South Yorkshire police had been front and centre in beating down the miners' strike 5 years earlier. And of course, it was the South Yorkshire police who were responsible for the multiple injustices, or predominantly responsible for the multiple injustices and cover-ups that happened after the Hillsborough disaster. So, yeah, and as you say, that kind of fight for justice is really still ongoing, and nobody, apart from the Sheffield Wednesday secretary, Graham Mackerel, has ever faced a criminal conviction for the Hillsborough disaster. So, yeah, and that's an interesting contrast to Heysel, because, in the case of Heysel, some Liverpool fans were given prison sentences. UEFA was found culpable in the court of law. The Royal Belgian Football Association was as well. So in this sense, I think, although Heisel's justice didn't satisfy everyone, at least there was an attempt to do it quite quickly. Hasn't happened with Hillsborough.
How do the immediate years after Hillsborough strike you?
I think it's a tough period for Liverpool supporters. I think I talk about this in relation to Kenny Dalglish. I do think
it's also fairly low.
Yeah, that's right.
A number of layers of problems in the city, and then this.
Yeah.
As well.
Yeah, so there's the long-term sort of decline in attendance that relates to the sort of the economic crisis of the 80s in Liverpool, which was the site of mass unemployment. Now that starts to change a little bit in the 90s and into the early 21st century as Liverpool sort of remade as a sort of heritage and tourist destination, and the docks are renovated, and
City of Culture.
Yeah, City of Culture, 2007, or 2007, 2008. So Liverpool, I think, reinvents itself as a sort of a bit of a tourist destination, a great place for a night out, and all of those things. But yes, I mean, I talk a bit in the book in terms of Kenny Dalglish about sort of PTSD after Hillsborough. And I think there's a form of collective PTSD around the club and the supporters. Obviously, on the back of Hillsborough, English football transforms itself into the English Premier League, all-seater stadiums, changing fundamentally the character of football, right? And pricing out a lot of the fans, as I mentioned in the book, who would have stood on the terraces at Hillsborough in April 1989. So I was obviously a big Liverpool fan. Then I was reading all the fanzines from those periods, some great Liverpool fanzines in that period. Through the Wind and Rain was my favourite. And there was a real sense of, I would say, rudderlessness about the club. They made a bad appointment when they replaced Kenny Dalglish with Graham Souness. Manchester United finally emerged from their slumber to kind of very painfully become England's leading club. And then Liverpool was trying to grapple with this new commercial age of football, where Anfield was changed to an all-seater stadium, for example. The Kop, obviously, this great terrace was closed to history as a standing space. And yeah, as I say in the book somewhere, I think the club gets caught between two stools. On the one hand, it's part of this commercialisation and gentrification of football, but on the other hand, it's not as good at it as Manchester United. And so the club falls behind. And a lot of the fan base, I think, gets a bit alienated. And success might have covered that up a bit, but there wasn't that much success in the 90s, which for Liverpool fans of that generation was just unheard of, from really sort of 64 through to 1990, Liverpool won stuff pretty much every season or most seasons.
Besides the attention on women's football, Liverpool, that attention you pay to the globalization of supporters is another thing in the kind of sources you use that sets this book apart, I think, from other regular club histories. That's a contested topic. So tourists in the stadium.
Yeah, absolutely.
The people choosing clubs as opposed to like you or me with Sturm, you get born into it.
Yeah.
Were any of these conversations, did any of those indicate that kind of rift is something that global supporters are aware of? And what was your intent in telling those stories as well?
Yeah. Good questions.
You're really going somewhere. I think
I think firstly, having lived as an expat in Canada since 2002, having lived abroad in other places, including in Germany in the 90s, and knowing there are places in the world that do not have such thriving football cultures as England and Germany, for example. I'm broadly speaking sympathetic to people from a long way from Liverpool who gravitate to the club. I think it's something, broadly speaking, that the city and the club should be proud of, and it contributes to making both of those institutions, the club and the city, more interesting places. You're right to say there is tension between the tourists and or out-of-towners and locals. And of course, that relates to some things that I think are beyond the control of those tourists, i.e. increased prices and the difficulty for kind of, working class or lower middle class fans to get tickets for games at Anfield. It is such a saga to do that now. I couldn't even begin to tell you how complicated it is to get tickets for Anfield for men's games. I think talking to some of the interviewees, like some Indian supporters who went to the 2018 Champions League final in Kyiv, they generally were welcome with open arms, but there's always a few people who'd say, well, what's this got to do with you? I think, as I was discussing in the Football Scholars Forum last week, that, there's always a danger of romanticizing the local as if the local is always better. As I talk about in the book, if we look at the local treatment of Liverpool's black population, both within football and more widely, in certainly the period around the Toxteth Rising in 1981, there's not necessarily a lot to be proud of there in prioritizing and valorizing the local. So, yeah, I guess just sort of, I'm always quite moved by stories of I love people who love sport, really. And so if someone decides to dedicate their life to following Liverpool from afar, which is not easy to do, and certainly wasn't easy to do for Stefan Köhler, who grew up in communist East Germany, or Wojciech Kaminski, who grew up in communist Poland, or Grant Farrad, who grew up in apartheid South Africa. Yeah. That requires it requires extensive commitment and as Farrad says, long distance love for the club. And I've chatted to those fans from all around the world in various places, and they're no less Liverpool supporters than the local supporters who follow the club. And in fact, I find it quite moving. There are people from Australia or Rwanda who've never actually been to the city of Liverpool, but donate to local causes, would join the spirit of Shankly, the supporters union.
Yeah.
I think that broadly speaking, those are the things to be proud of as a club and a city. There are tensions, absolutely, but I think the tensions are less between the different type of fan than they are by the fact that so many people have been priced out of modern football.
Yes. Yeah. And if there's any city in English football that can make a case that the globalization of the game now fits the past and the identity of the city, I think it is Liverpool as a historically an outward-looking city, a city that kind of had its own globalization going on early.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, a city that has...
make that case here, I think, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's a city that has quite, a complicated international history in the sense that, Liverpool was really nothing until the slave trade made Liverpool this very important city and empire. So, there's a complex and quite dark history of the city of Liverpool that the city, I think, is coming to terms with. It's built an international slavery museum, there are attempts to sort of deal with that, but it's, undeniable that that's kind of part of the reason why Liverpool is the city it is, relates to this very dark element of world history. So I think in a way, there's something quite nice about the idea that you can sort of repay that a little by making something less damaging. Music, the Beatles back in the day, or some of the great bands of the 80s, or particularly football, in kind of drawing a more benign international attention to the city. And it's a huge element of like tourism in the city. People come to Liverpool to watch football games, and that in a city that has, since the kind of decline of the docks, has not really it's never been a city with big industries that produces a lot. So tourism's essential to the city. And so, nobody's in a position to turn up their nose at international supporters who want to pay too much for merchandise and go to tourist quarters and whatever. I mean, that's part of the lifeblood of the city now. And it makes it a very special place on match day weekends, even if you can't get a ticket for love nor money.
Yeah. The history of fan activism, of fans taking a role in the club, in advocacy, either directly toward the club or toward the public, is a current in the book as well. How much, maybe as we come to a close, how much of that thread of activism and proactive engagement of what the club is becoming, of what football is becoming, and how the public views the game, how much of that is left, you think, in and around Liverpool? So Spirit of Shankly, that, how much of that do you see going forward? I
think it's still thriving. It might not seem that way in the sort of commercial juggernaut and the sports washing landscape that we see for international football now. But there are people still, not just in Liverpool, who are fighting the good fight. The spirit of Shankly, the supporters union, which was founded when Liverpool was under the disastrous ownership of George Gillette and Tom Hicks, the American owners. They campaign still on ticket pricing, and English supporters have got together in recent years to kind of put a cap on ticket pricing for away matches, for away supporters in England. Obviously, Liverpool supporters through this Spirit of Shankly have done ongoing Hillsborough campaigning around the 2022 Champions League final, when more because of the behaviour of Liverpool fans than the French police, there was no loss of life in what could have been a second Heysel disaster. So, those voices are still there. I think not just at Liverpool and not just in England, but in other places. I think, how much impact they've had is open to debate, like where that activism leads. I think you can certainly see that the fan activism around Hillsborough had a profound impact. It actually revived and drove forward the campaign that eventually led to changes in the legal decisions around Hillsborough, and the manslaughter charges and that were eventually put forward in 2016. And, the club said that the fans have had some success temporarily on a number of issues. The walkout against Sunderland to protest against £77 ticket prices. There was protests in COVID against the furloughing of staff, against the European Super League as well. So I think fans still have a voice, and I think Liverpool fans, have this supporters union that advocates. It doesn't always feel as if change is happening as football moves towards this kind of European Super League where it feels like there's so much content that it's just going to eat itself as a game. And I know that disillusions a lot of supporters, again, not just Liverpool fans. And some of them move away perhaps from their deep engagement with the club. They go and watch, I know a lot of my friends, probably some of yours, will watch more grassroots football now or more women's football because it feels a bit purer and you can afford it and it's easier to get into. But I think there are still fans trying to keep the people who run our game honest. And, I think that's actually a pretty proud legacy of both the Heysel and Hillsborough disasters. That was when that fan activism in Liverpool was really born, I think. It kind of was two very different wake-up calls for fans to start advocating for the kind of game they wanted to see.
After this book, what's your relationship to the club like? You mentioned you had an event in Liverpool.
I did, yeah.
The club reached out. What kind of traction have you gotten around the club?
No, the club hasn't reached out. I mean, they gave me a little bit of, I think like a lot of football clubs, I don't think history, as we understand history, and archives are really the club's priority, So all the stuff that I would have found cool, like all the letters that would have been written to Bill Shankly or Ian Rush or Kenny Dalglish or even Patrick Berger, I'm sure the club couldn't care less about them. And so I did get a few bits of material from the club's archive, but they weren't super forthcoming. Not completely unsupportive, but I think, club history is probably not their main priority. Certain individuals at the club and, were definitely supportive. But in a way, I'm not interested in writing an approved institutional history of the club. That's not kind of like what I'd like to do. And like most supporters of quote unquote big clubs in the 21st century, I think we all thinking supporters have ambiguous relationships with the clubs they love because, as I say in the start of the book, nobody knows better the failings and weaknesses of a club than their own supporters. So, when you hold up a critical lens to any club history, you'll see good and you'll see bad. And there were times in this process, I remember saying to my wife once, I think I'm seeing and thinking about too much football, which is an unprecedented statement for me. Because sometimes, you can just be too close to the action. I remember talking to some Spirit of Shankly activists about this, that they just found out a bit too much about the workings of the club, that it kind of spoiled their enjoyment of the game.
I've heard that too from an activist, yeah.
Yeah, and I think that can be tough because it takes away from just the joy of watching football. But then, at least in the elite men's game, there is so much to take away from the enjoyment of watching it now. That it's always, I think, there's a lot of mixed feelings about supporting a sort of a quote unquote big club these days. And I think particularly actually in the 2025, the city of Liverpool and Liverpool we've had a near tragedy at the parade for the championship in the spring. Then, of course, the tragic death of Diogo Jota. Then, of course, the death of the former Liverpool women's manager, Matt Beard. So this year has actually been a very heavy one, and it makes you think about kind of, even leaving aside all of the problems with football globally from Infantino down, it makes you think about, it kind of dilutes some of the joys, I think, at least sometimes anyway. But you can't walk away, as I say at the end of the book. I mean, it's here. I mean, I can't change now, so I'm not going to suddenly just abandon being a Liverpool fan. So, I'm stuck with it, and generally it brings me more happiness than sadness.
Yeah. And last but not least, not just for the Spirit of Shankly, but supporters organization in general, I think the push to push your club to pay attention to the archives and how you collect and maintain your sources is a worthwhile one. We need club histories like this, and we won't have them if these sources disappear.
Absolutely.
I think that's a fight that's on, in my opinion.
Yeah. No, you're absolutely right. I mean, the greatest source that I got for the book, and I relate the story with lots of joy, was, the 2 bags of letters I got from Bill Shankly's grandson, when I walked into the Shankly Hotel. And, but that gives you an idea, just the way I got those archives, just how haphazard a lot of sports archives generally are. I don't think generally it's easy to find archival material for sports clubs. And that's even before we get to the difficulties you have in tracing women's sports history or women's football club. I mean, there's just so little on LFC women. I think you're right. Like, club archives can and should be much more important. But I don't. I don't know. Yeah, and obviously, but I think the way clubs present their archives, or obviously it's about sort of the museumification of club history in a way, and like official stories. So, you know, some of the stuff I got from the club was great, like the letters from Italians around Heysel. But of course, those were letters that, broadly speaking, put Liverpool in a good light.
Yeah.
I'm sure there were angrier letters.
Right. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, exactly. So, yeah, anyway.
Yeah. Good. Are you on to any new football projects already, or just enjoying them?
I have. I've worked on a book with my colleague Tony Shaw. It's called Cold War Football: A History in 10 Matches, and it's going to be out in time for the World Cup from Cambridge University Press. My old friends at Cambridge. So, yeah, following a bit of the Jonathan Wilson format, 10 games from the Cold War, some of which listeners will probably know, and some of which are a bit more obscure. And yeah, it was fun. After that, I need to have a break from writing books for a bit. So, yeah.
Wonderful. Well, and there's a World Cup summer, so
now there's a World Cup, so there'll be a lot of I mean, Canada's a co-host, of course. Right. So I'm sure there'll be lots of interest in media, because, you know, we don't have a lot of soccer historians north of the border. So I'll probably get some media requests to talk about many depressing and stressful elements of the World Cup as it's looking like it will shape up to be. But, you know, we'll see.
Wonderful. Well, for now, it's Dreams and Songs to Sing, Cambridge University Press from Alan McDougall. I have it in hardback. Is it coming out in paperback as well?
It will be coming out in paperback later this year, I think. So, yeah. And yeah. Thanks for all your support. And thanks for the chat today, Philip.
Thank you for your time, Alan. Always good. Be well.
You too. Take care.
And another academic book with a lot of focus on football clubs next time we get together. The clubs are Tottenham Hotspur, Ajax Amsterdam, Bayern Munich, and Austria Vienna. Do you see a through line? If not, do you want to wait or Google it? In 2 weeks, the author is with us. Until then,